For me, the recent events unfolding in Afghanistan have brought to light a lot of interesting questions about games and how they fit into our world. As I watched the news, the game that immediately came to mind was A Distant Plain, which attempts to recreate the recent history of the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan from 2003 to 2013. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I thought it might be interesting to take a look at this game as a means to understand what is happening in that part of the world. Welcome to Legendary Tactics.
Now, just before we explore A Distant Plain, we'd like to offer a caveat to our viewers that this game is set in Afghanistan and players take control of various factions to guide Afghan affairs. And with recent events, we understand that some viewers might be uncomfortable with the subject, and we don't mean in any way to trivialize this conflict.
Yes.
So let us get started. So, Nato, you are a C.O.I.N enthusiast.
I am.
And I'm wondering if you can set the scene for me here. What context are we looking at? Where and when is the game set? And what do I need to know?
Yes, well, there's three scenarios. This one is in particular is set to begin in 2009 and runs until 2013. It's considered to be the short scenario. And you can see a lot of multicolored blocks and a relatively brown map.
This map actually looks very different than some of the other C.O.I.N games, which seem to be more elongated. This one seems more clustered and compact. Does that affect the gameplay?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you've played Cuba Libre, which, you're battling on a very narrow island, it is a very linear kind of, approach. Everywhere you go heads to Havana at some point. But this is a little more circular in the sense that there's much less of a front line as there might be in Cuba Libre to some extent. I know every C.O.I.N game is based on the idea that there are no front lines, that the type of conflict that it is looking to recreate is completely chaotic. And really,
that's right.
We've
Very
come a
guerrilla
long
style.
ways from Napoleonic times when everyone would line up in pretty lines and come running at each other. Just doesn't happen.
Now, before we get too much into the game, actually, you've got a ton of these C.O.I.N games on your shelf. Where would you place this game relative to the others in terms of your top 10?
It's a great question. There are some titles like Gandhi, which I feel like I maybe haven't played enough of. But I would have to say this might be my number one. And although it would be close between Fire in the Lake and this one, those really are, they're recreating, different conflicts in many ways. And Fire in the Lake certainly has a lot more rules overhead. But
so what appeals to you about this game then?
For me, it's the dynamics between the factions. That's what has really intrigued me. If you look at Cuba Libre, for example, the green faction, the cartels, they're very limited in what they can do, and that it is true to some extent with the greens in this game as well. But what I love about this is the intricacy of the design, in the sense that everything you do affects someone on the board. So every action that you take helps or hinders another player on the board at all times. So every decision matters, and it's just everything interlocks. It's a really, really clever and intricate design that I've no idea how you even begin to conceptualize a design like this. It really is tough to pull off.
So it's an asymmetrical game, but there's also asymmetrical impacts on the different factions who are opposing you on the board too.
Yes, definitely. And that's going to be true to some extent with any game where you have four players battling it out over whatever. You're going to have that happen. But I just find that it's so meshed together here that it really is an interesting four-way tug of war, I guess. It might be a good way to put it.
Well, how be we dive into the factions then? So,
sure.
Who do we play as if we're setting up our first game?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the setup for the 2009 scenario. So, for those, I'll just go through the factions here very quickly. So we have the Coalition. The Coalition is the coalition of Western powers, such as the United States, Canada, the UK, that were there to as part of the to complete the Afghan mission, which by some definitions was nation building, peacekeeping. There's various roles that they played.
Various motivations there for each of the powers.
Yes, and as an overall goal, their idea is to, and this is just kind of interesting the way things are playing out in reality here. But the goal, by the standards of the game, is to build up as much support for the Afghan government as possible, and then at the same time have the smallest possible footprint in terms of boots on the ground.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because you don't want to impact Afghanistan too much with external forces, but you do need to be there in a supporting role.
Well, yeah, but it was also from the political side of things from home. If you have a large force, I mean, the same thing kind of happened in Vietnam. There was so many soldiers over in a foreign country fighting, and it became very unpopular.
That's right. Well, and it drives opposition. It drives the insurgency.
It can do, and casualties. Casualties are a factor for the coalition. You want minimal casualties. You want as light a footprint as you need to build up this, the support for the Afghan government. And again, I think it's fair to say the goal was to create a government in Afghanistan that was able to sustain itself. And unfortunately, events have not transpired that way, as it's obvious now. But that, I think, was at least in part the goal of the coalition.
That's right. So it looks like there are a set of operations that all powers can do, and then there are special activities for this nation. So we can surge, airlift, or airstrike.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the basic C.O.I.N operations for most factions involve training, which is generally putting more pieces on the board. Then you have your patrol in this case, where you get to stroll along the roads and keep them clear. The sweep, where you reveal insurgents that are otherwise underground, and assault, which is an attack. And then so you usually have that on the government side of things, is something along those lines, where you have train, patrol, sweep, and assault are going to be common to a lot of government factions, not only in this game, but also across the C.O.I.N series, at least the early games. Because in the certainly the early games, these roads, I mean, in Afghanistan, there's only one road really that runs across the entire country. But for most, certainly like Andean Abyss, protecting those lines of communication is a very important part of the role of the government. It keeps the economy going. And
right. Now, you created a Choose Your Own Path video on the C.O.I.N series, and I'll link to that in the card above here. But in that video, you described this game as one that's a balance of politics and war, and it's about brinkmanship. So where does the political side of things come in?
Well, that's as we move on to the government, the Afghan government player, that's where that comes into play, because you have the coalition that's there to build support and to win the hearts and minds, and then get out as best as possible and have the fewest units on the ground. The Afghan government is mainly concerned with force in terms of controlling militarily the territory. So if you look on the board, you'll see there are these spaces underneath the name of the territory. You have these spaces where it says C.O.I.N control here,
yes,
or neutral. So the Afghan government is concerned with C.O.I.N control. They need to make sure that the places are under military control, essentially. Whereas the coalition, if you look at Kabul, you'll see the support here, and this is basically what their goal is to have the support of the population for the Afghan government. Okay, so that's their goal. So they're working in similar ways together, but they are also in opposition in some ways as well. So it's what has been called a marriage of inconvenience, and that is because one of the operations that the government has is called govern, and what that allows the Afghan government to do is to convert the support that perhaps the coalition forces have built and turn that into patronage, essentially bribing the leaders within the country that they need to work with. And reading in the designer's notes, it's basically because the Afghan government understands that the U.S. and the rest of the coalition forces are not going to be there forever. And they know that they have to operate in Afghanistan, and the way things work there is there's a lot of bribery that happens. So unfortunately, though, that bribery undermines the support that the population has in the Afghan government. So at the cost of support, they can actually work towards their goals, which is making sure that they're lining the pockets of the people they need to have good favor with in order to run the country when the coalition forces leave. I know that was a very wordy explanation. I hope that was clear, but
that's
that's the idea. So
I really like the connections between the game and I used to teach the novel The Kite Runner, and so we looked at a lot of the reasons for the conflicts and some of the intricacies of how the economy is intertwined with the warlords and the opium trade and that sort of. And I mean, at first you think, well, why don't you just get rid of opium? Well, you can't. I mean, they're all conjoined.
Yes.
And it's really interesting to see this come alive in a game.
And that leads us to the third faction, which is the Warlords, and they are mainly concerned with. Two things. They want to make as much money as they can by harvesting their opium fields. And they actually also want the country to be more or less uncontrolled. The more government like coin control, government control, or control by the Taliban are both bad for business. They need
They need a bit of chaos.
They need a bit of chaos. They need to be left alone in order to do with what they're doing. And so their goal is to build up uncontrol across the board. So to build territories where there is no control, and also to make as much money as possible and have more than 40 resources, which represents the money. So they're as an insurgent faction, there are 4 actions, as are most insurgent factions actions, especially in the early games in the series. You have rally, which is add more forces, march, which is move around, attack, and then terror, which is to terrorize the region. And then obviously the warlords are going to be concerned with cultivating and trafficking and then bribing forces as well. So they're more of the wild card in the situation, because they don't have any sort of allegiance. They don't have any grand goals, per se. They're looking to cause as much disruption and so forth as possible.
Right. Just a specific question here on their card. It says plus Suborn ?
Yes.
And likewise with Suborn, it says max 3 spaces. Can you just explain what that means?
So typically, anytime it is your turn, and we can touch on this, how that works, but anytime it is your turn, that you would choose an operation. So you choose one operation, and then that in green on this card, where it says plus any special activity, if you have the opportunity to take a special activity, then that's the limit of the ones you can take. So for example, if you do an attack as an operation, you can't follow up with a cultivate or traffic special action. Okay. You can only do a Suborn special action.
That makes sense.
Yes. And Suborn, that's a word that I wasn't as familiar with. It basically means bribe, essentially. and that's how, the effect in the game. So there's limitations on the special activities that can follow an operation, if you have an opportunity to take a special action as well.
I think I'm getting more appreciation for this now that I've played a lot of Root, because
Yes.
I'm starting to see how each faction has its own set of goals.
Yes, and Root is at least what I heard was that it was based on the C.O.I.N series.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that.
Yeah. So
actually, one other question I have for you too is I think a lot of war gamers play games like this that cover real world events and conflicts because they want to learn more, and it's a portal into another part of the world, and sometimes they want to recreate or present an alternate reality to what happened. So what would you say we can learn from a game like this?
well, and that's kind of my stance. Like when I did my recent video asking these questions, my view on these types of games, what's always been most exciting to me is the educational aspect, the opportunity to learn by putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. It's a different culture, a different type of a different faction, that kind of thing. Each faction has their own unique perspective and goals and so forth. So I've always seen that as an educational opportunity to really interact with the the history in a way that you can't do with a book. You can't do that
Because
with a
you
movie.
can become part of it, and you can change the course of that history.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, that's always been the appeal of these types of games. As far as what we can learn from this, I think it's important, as far as this conflict goes specifically. I think one of the things that I came away with was the tremendous complexity of the situation in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And in reality, more probably all conflict is more complex than it first appears.
Oh, absolutely. And you can't possibly capture everything in a board game. We understand the limitations of this format.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I know for me it was the sense of the confusion and the chaos and the conflicting goals of everyone. That for me was what I took away from this game most of all. Was that
Interesting. What's interesting, when I used to teach the novel The Kite Runner, it really focuses on the ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and I see that this game doesn't even really get to plumb the depths of civilian life in terms of being Pashto or Tajik or Uzbek or Hazara, and there's another whole layer of complexity beneath the surface of these are the powers that are vying for control of that populace. But do you ever see any kind of civilian impact in the game? Or?
Well, I mean, if you look on the board here, so if you look at, and I'm not even sure if I'm able to pronounce these correctly, but say Bamiyan versus Ghazni. So Ghazni is a Pashtun area. What's written in green with the Arabic writing above it is a Pashtun area. So certain operations conducted by certain groups will be more limited depending on which ethnic group happens to be in that area.
Oh, okay. Then I stand corrected. This does reflect.
The level of detail in this, it's it really is a real design feat, a masterpiece in many ways, because the level, because it's so playable as well. Like it deals with all this, but it's so playable. So you have the Pashtun, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, Pashtun areas.
Yes,
you have the more more mountain tribes in the north.
Okay, yes.
And so it's going to matter, especially I believe for the Warlords. If I'm not mistaken, there's some things that are affected depending on your. It's for the Taliban. Sorry, your operations are going to be helped or hindered by the ethnic group in that area.
Okay, well, why don't we get into the Taliban then?
Yeah, so the Taliban their goals in this are essentially the opposite of the of the coalition. Instead of support, and I'm just going to zoom in on Kabul here. Instead of support, they're looking to build opposition to the Afghan government. And in addition to that, they are looking to establish bases. And these bases, so you've got the cubes, which represent the foot soldiers, or the mobile forces. These round tokens are bases. And so they're essentially, as it kind of implies, it's a base of operations, but it can imply a lot more than just a military base. It's infrastructure, as far as being able to conduct the operations that they want. In the case of the Warlords, they call it a base, but essentially it's a base of operations in terms of opium production. So it's not a military base per se that's represented there. But the goal of the Taliban is essentially to get getting a certain number of bases plus total opposition in the country. Oh, and I forgot to mention as well the goals of the government. We got kind of sidetracked there. Their goal is a certain amount of coin-controlled population, which
right.
is, C.O.I.N. And if you're not familiar, is short for counterinsurgency. So it's a general term. It represents either coalition or government control of a territory. So their goal is a certain amount of coin control in the country, plus patronage, that they've paid out enough in bribes that they're going to be able to, with the influence that they've received from that said bribes, they're able to run the country, if you will, in the way that they operate. So
okay, so what are the special activities then of the Taliban?
So the special activities are things like extort, infiltrate, which is exchanging essentially government, well, it says non-coalition pieces, so either warlord pieces or Afghan government pieces, to changing them over to Taliban, essentially getting them to flip sides. And they have ambush, which is an attack. If their unit is underground, they can do a sneak attack to do additional damage when they're doing an attack operation. It basically automatically succeeds when they don't have to roll for their attack. They can just automatically succeed. And the cubes are the cubes, like they don't change. So, but for the government, the coalition, they are what they are. But the insurgents have a side which is face down, where they're underground, and a side where they're face up, and that is when they're exposed and vulnerable to attack. So okay. The government or the coalition can do a sweep operation.
The sweep finds that, okay.
And that flips them over to what they call active status, and they can be found and attacked and so forth. If they're underground, then you cannot attack them unless it's by some event or something like that, because they're essentially undetectable.
Huh. I can see why you really are drawn to this game. It definitely has a lot of complexity, and lots of layers to it.
Yes, and no. It's interesting because the rule set is about 12 pages, which sounds like a lot, but when one of those pages is the title page, and then you've got one where it just goes through the pieces, and so forth. So the rules I find with these games, now they did add a lot of things for, say, Fire in the Lake or whatever, but certainly the first 3 games in the C.O.I.N. series, rules-wise, are not actually that heavy. But where it gets complex is trying to figure out what lever to pull, what button to push. How do you get things moving and moving towards victory, right? That's where with every C.O.I.N. game I've ever bought, there's this feeling where I set it up and you just stare at the board and you just say, I have no idea what to do. But the thing is, you just start doing actions. You just start, do some movement, do some sweeps, do some attacks, see how everything fits together, and it tends to work once you see how everything's interacting, then it works really well.
No, I think there's one last element we should talk about here, and that's the deck of cards. And I flipped it over, and I can see that the Hazara are mentioned here, and they're a population that has struggled in Afghanistan as sort of an underclass. But so what kind of flavor do you get with the game on these cards? What story gets told through these?
Well, for the most part, this is the political dimension that you'd addressed earlier. So you have a card like Strategic Partners here. So each event, or most event cards, have a top event and a bottom event. And at the top, you have the four symbols representing the four factions. And so what happens here, so if we look at break time, the Warlords would be the first faction to play or pass.
Okay.
And then next up would be the coalition, then the Taliban, then the Afghan government. And so depending who is played, who is passed, each card, basically 2 factions can play per card. So, but they're going to be limited by this sequence of play. I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but basically if, let's say, the Warlords choose to take that event, then that means that the second faction who's up, which in this case is the coalition, can then take an operation and they may add a special activity.
Right.
So if you want to prevent someone from using a special activity, they may do an operations only and limit what the other factions are able to do. So there's a real back and forth as you are looking at the card. You get an advanced look at the next card that's due to come up. And so you have a card that you're playing currently, and you get a quick look at the next card. And so you've got to figure out, well, do I want to play this card, or do I want to pass and play on the next one, or what have you? So it has a real back and forth. And each card, and this is actually something that's really interesting about the C.O.I.N games, the event cards in these games, is there is an upper part and a lower part. The upper part typically benefits the government factions, or in this case, so you can see the coalition removes up to a die roll of guerrillas. The bottom part generally will benefit the insurgents. So in this case, remove up to a die roll of government cubes, no more than 1 per space. And what's fascinating about this is a lot of it is dealing with the same events. If something happens, there's there's often 2 or more sides to the story, and so what might look like a good event for one side may actually have a different effect. So you kind of, the event will happen. So if you have a certain event that happened in reality, but it could have gone either way. The effects of that event could have been good for the coalition or bad for the coalition, or good for the Warlords or bad for the Warlords. So it's kind of neat in that the narrative gets steered through these historical happenings, but their effects are different every single game. So it's a really interesting mechanic that is really unique to these to these games. So
interesting. Now, are there any other elements that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, the only other element that I think is really an interesting aspect of this game that's worth looking at is just this very quickly is the Islamabad Track. So the idea behind this track is that it's an abstract way of representing the relationship with Pakistan and the Taliban and the coalition and so forth. So if you can have Islamabad or Pakistan go all the way from they start and they tend to float towards backing the Taliban, but due to certain events or whatever, you could actually build them up to the point where they're actually hostile to the Taliban. So if you look there, it was automated there. I don't know if you caught that, but what it will do is if Pakistan is hostile to the Taliban, if you read the effects of it, it says no Taliban rally in Pakistan. So Taliban forces cannot build there. and Taliban in Pakistan are always active. So if you look, as soon as I drop this on here, if you watch the guerrillas, they all flip to their exposed side. And that's because Pakistan is not helping them and is in fact working against them. Or you can go on the other end where they're essentially sponsoring them, where they're making it tremendously easy for them to operate. And so Pakistan becomes this area of the board where only the Taliban can play there. But it becomes it's more or less a safe haven for them to build up their forces, and then from there they march across the border into these border provinces.
That's neat. That simulates Osama bin Laden when he was hiding in Pakistan.
Maybe, but even at the end of each campaign, which is marked by what they call propaganda card, it's interesting because all the Taliban forces that aren't at a base retreat back to Pakistan because winter's apparently really cold in Afghanistan, and so they basically go home in that time of year. So, and each campaign, which is a certain number of cards before you hit what's called a propaganda card, it counts the timeline is a little bit fluid, but it's a certain time frame in which probably close basically to a year. And there's a propaganda card. So as soon as you see a propaganda card, you run through this little victory check and this little procedure, and then you move on with the game from there. And then at the time of the propaganda card, if any faction is in a winning position, as in they've met their victory conditions, then the game ends and they're the victor. If no one's met their victory conditions, the game continues. And then if at the end no one's won the game previously, you see who has the best score out of the bunch.
Excellent.
So,
well, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
You've caught my interest. This is something we need to play.
Yes,
now.
yes. I think it is. It's a very intriguing design. I think it's best played with 4 players. There are
Right.
bots provided by the designers where you can play against a flow chart essentially, and it's great. It's a little bit. It adds a little bit of overhead, or I should say, a lot of overhead to gameplay. But it's amazing that we're able to play a game as complex as this and have essentially an AI, that will give us a great challenge. But if you are playing with 3 players, you could likely get away with a bot for the Warlords. I've heard many people say they're of the 4 factions, they're the least interesting to play. Their way of path to victory is more straightforward than the others, I think, is why the people say that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It would be embarrassing to lose to a flowchart, though.
You know what? It happens. I have played many games solitaire in C.O.I.N, and those flowcharts are, you'd be surprised how cunning they can be. It's really funny, but they always seem to do exactly what you least want them to do.
Absolutely. Oh, and I found your card here, NATO politics.
Oh yes, there we go.
Awesome.
Yes.
Very good. Any last thoughts before we sign off?
Yeah, as I said just at the outset, I just wanted to reiterate. I know that there's a lot of crazy stuff. I mean, there's been crazy stuff going on in Afghanistan for 20 years. Let's face it.
Oh, for 200
years. Yeah, really.
I mean, they've been invaded mercilessly.
Yes. And I know it's very much a part of the news right now, and a very sensitive kind of thing for many people. I go back to why I play games like this, and again, it's to learn. It's to expand my experience. I've never been to Afghanistan. I know I have friends who are Afghani, but I've never been there myself. So I think it's just something that is so important to really understand. Just as a quick aside, I'll just reference another C.O.I.N game, which is the first one in the series, Andean Abyss. I bought it originally because I read stellar reviews of it, and I never would have thought that I would have ever bought a game concerning the civil war in Colombia.
Right.
It just, to me, it was not something I knew anything about. I have some friends who are Colombian, and we've actually had some really great discussions about the Civil War and life in Colombia, because I know of the factions involved. I know a little bit of what happened. I know, I'm aware of key events and leadership and so forth that I honestly would never have ever known about. I can't imagine an instance where I really would have delved that deeply into a topic like that. And C.O.I.N has always, or for the most part, steered towards conflicts that are a little bit off the beaten track.
Yes. It's not World War I and World War II.
Yes, exactly. Which traditionally, and this is part of the expansion of games that I'm seeing now, the variety of games. I mean, just hearing about an upcoming game called Votes for Women, which is a game about the women's suffrage movement. That's amazing. Like the fact that we can delve into those corners of history,
Yes.
and that the hobby is moving in a direction like that is just so exciting to me. So,
to draw attention to them. And I mean, a game designed by Volko, it's going to be fantastic.
Yes.
He's a fantastic game designer, and so yeah, there's a lot in a Volko game.
Yes, absolutely. So anyway, I hope this little introduction, I know it maybe went a little bit long, but I hope you stuck around to get a sense of this game and to see if this is the kind of thing that you would be interested in giving a try at some point.
It's great. Thank you so much for walking me and our audience through it. And as always, we encourage you to buy physical copies of the games to support GMT and the designers of the games to keep games like these coming out.
Yes, and I can't remember what edition this game is in. I think it's at least third, maybe more. So it's been a popular title, which is which is great.
I can see why. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is Legendary Tactics, and we appreciate you watching.